Hello, welcome to the workshop on writing personal statements for residency applications in medicine. I'm Marilyn Gray, the director of the Graduate Writing Center. We have developed this workshop on the basis of our experiences working with medical students as well as reviewing successful examples and best practice advice. We encourage you to watch this video to get an overview of this document. After writing a first draft of your personal statement, you are welcome to make an appointment at the Graduate Writing Center to get feedback. The writing consultants are trained to read and respond to personal statements, including personal statements for residency. At the link in this slide, you can find instructions for making appointments online. You are welcome to keep making appointments until you feel your personal statement is in good shape. You're also welcome to do your appointments via Skype if it's difficult to come to the Graduate Writing Center in person. After you've revised your statement, we encourage you to seek additional feedback and guidance from the appropriate faculty and staff at the medical school. Here is an overview of the structure of this presentation. We will start with an overview of purpose and audience considerations. We will then talk about the structure of the personal statement in some detail. And finally, we will offer some additional advice about the writing process and further resources. The main documents of a residency application are the personal statement, CV, recommendation letters, and the medical student performance evaluation. It's always good to think about how the documents work together as a package to create a coherent picture of the applicant. While you don't want too much redundancy between certain documents, you also don't want the documents to seem unrelated. The relationship between the CV and personal statement can be particularly tricky. There are basically two extremes to avoid. On one hand, you don't want the personal statement to read like a long version of the CV, which would be redundant and not highlight the personal dimensions that the personal statement is supposed to convey. On the other hand, the opposite pitfall would be when an applicant doesn't mention important experiences or accomplishments in the personal statement because they think it's sufficient to list them in the CV. While the personal statement wouldn't cover the information in the same way as the CV, the personal statement should create a compelling narrative about the applicant that highlights the most important and interesting features of the applicant's background. So you wouldn't simply repeat the CV information, but you would integrate and elaborate key points to create a strong narrative. At the Graduate Writing Center, we like to talk about the personal statement with a few different metaphors. One of them is that the personal statement as a whole is an argument to persuade the audience, that is, the program director or potentially a committee, of why you're an excellent fit for the residency, how well you have prepared for this specialization, and how the residency would benefit from accepting you. The statement as a whole should have the effect of achieving this argument, but you are not necessarily stating these arguments directly. Show rather than tell. You achieve the argumentative objective by presenting yourself as an excellent, well-prepared candidate for this specialization, in addition to being a well-rounded professional in terms of your personal qualities and knowledge of the specialization. Another metaphor we like to use for the personal statement is the metaphor of a portrait, because it's another way to explain the effect that the statement should have on the reader. The statement is painting a picture of the candidate so that you leave a clear positive impression in the mind of the reader. You want that portrait to be one of a serious professional who's very engaged with patients and solving problems. You want to give specific examples from clinical rotations or volunteer work that show you as a professional in action. Use concrete details and vivid language so that the portrait is clear and specific to you and your specialty. I would say that a few examples given in more detail and reflected upon would be more effective than including many examples with less elaboration. You don't have a lot of space, so choose examples that you can really use to demonstrate professional maturity and build your narrative. It's also important to project positivity and confidence. The audience for the personal statement is primarily program directors for your specialization. The heart of the argument and narrative you are constructing is your motivation for choosing this specialty. How did you come to choose this specialty? Why this specialty? Why will you excel in this specialty? You want to present a clear motivation backed up by examples that are specific to the specialty. If you could swap out the specialty for another one and the statement would still make sense, then you are not tailoring your narrative specifically enough to the specialty. Any examples you include of working with patients in clinical rotations or volunteer work should relate to the specialty. If your choice of specialty entails working with a specific population, then you would also want to convey your experience with and knowledge of the target population. One issue that comes up is how soon to identify the specialty in the text of the personal statement. I would say don't delay identifying the specialty. You would preferably indicate it in the first paragraph, at least through the choice of an example or how you open the statement. At the very least, the specialty should be identified no later than the first sentence of the second paragraph. The personal statement for residency is more professional than personal. Even though you will encounter advice encouraging the personal side, what is really meant is for you to describe the set of experiences and personal qualities that are motivating your choice of specialty. Other personal background details may also contribute to your professional motivation, but try not to go too far afield. A common pitfall we see is when people use examples that are not related to the specialty, but may motivate their interest in medicine more generally. Sometimes this happens because people go back to the statement they used when applying for medical school. I would caution against using examples prior to your time in medical school unless they relate directly to your specialization. This personal statement should demonstrate your motivation for your specific specialty, not for becoming a doctor more generally. In addition to addressing the audience of your specialty, your personal statement will have a somewhat different emphasis in content, depending on whether you are pursuing academic medicine or clinical practice at a community hospital. If you are pursuing academic medicine, you should describe experiences with teaching, mentoring, and being an educator, including relevant volunteer experiences, as well as your interest in and commitment to being an educator. You should also describe your experience with research and potentially your research interests if appropriate. Sometimes people will list this kind of information in their CV, but not address it in the personal statement. However, it is important to bring teaching and research experience into the narrative of the personal statement if you are pursuing academic medicine. If you're going into clinical practice, then you're going to elaborate more on your experiences with patients and on your personal qualities and experiences that prepare you for the profession, such as leadership and teamwork. If you by any chance are keeping your options open and applying to both academic and non-academic residency programs, then try to find a balance by addressing teaching and research experience, but maybe not in quite as much detail. So this is a typical structure for a personal statement with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. The introduction should indicate the specialty. The body may be organized in different ways, analytically, thematically, chronologically, or narratively. The conclusion is usually fairly short, tying things together and making some sort of final statement about your career goals. Let's talk a little bit more about introductions. I've read the following advice for a personal statement. Begin your essay with an attention grabber, a quote, a story, an anecdote, or a riddle. One of the most common pitfalls we see is when people attempt to do this but don't execute it very well. I am also personally a little bit skeptical about using a quote or a riddle unless it really means something that can tie in with your overall narrative. Too often these devices feel tacked on and kind of gimmicky. So in terms of writing a good introduction, it's a common opening device to use an anecdote or a story, but it works best when it's strongly connected to the specialty or the motivation for choosing the specialty. However, you can also start the personal statement with a more direct statement about why you've chosen your specialty and what about this particular specialty you find engaging and rewarding. I feel like a direct opening works better if the writer feels more natural stating their interest that way rather than using one of the opening devices mentioned earlier. You don't have to open with an anecdote, and it's better not to if it feels contrived. So, to reiterate, you want to avoid anecdotes or other opening devices that do not lead into the motivation for choosing your specialty very well. Try to avoid cliched language like, I have a passion for. This is a classic example of telling rather than showing. While it may be okay to state a passion for something, maybe one time in an essay, it's more important that you demonstrate passion through the way you portray yourself. It's better to show rather than to tell. If you use cliched language or generic statements, you are often wasting the space that could be used for other information that would contribute more strongly to your narrative. So here is the way I would describe the main structural patterns for personal statements. You could have a predominantly narrative structure that starts with an anecdote or narrative example and keeps a narrative thread through the entire statement. These are challenging to do, but can be very effective when done well. A more common structure would be to open with a relevant anecdote and then transition to a more thematic or analytical presentation of experiences and qualifications. At the end, you could return to the narrative thread that you opened with, but you don't have to. I would advise against it if it feels contrived. And finally, as mentioned earlier, you could open more directly with an explanation of your interest in the specialty and proceed with the body of your statement organized by themes or topics. You would still use examples as evidence of your experience and motivation. For any of these organizational patterns, try to have good topic sentences and transitions between paragraphs, because this will help your reader. So we've already discussed how the structure of the body could be organized narratively or thematically. So now let's talk about how to work with the claims and content you incorporate in the body of the personal statement. Since the document is so short, you want to provide examples and details that support the points you make, but you don't want to include too many details or too many examples if they don't contribute anything new or substantive. Going back to the idea of the portrait, you want to use vivid, specific details and clear language. You want to present yourself as a professional in action and convey your values and engagement with your specialty. The concluding paragraph functions as a synthesis or wrap-up of the personal statement that also addresses career goals. One pitfall is when people who've started the statement with an anecdote or narrative device return to this device but don't execute it very smoothly, or they don't add anything meaningful to the statement by doing so. The effect of returning to a device without adding anything substantive is that it can come across as contrived. In that case, you should consider whether it's really necessary to return to the narrative device or whether the statement would make sense with a more straightforward closing. Now let's talk about revision strategies. After you do a draft, make an outline of the content. Identify the main purpose of each paragraph and the main subpoints. Try to remove anything that seems redundant or too generic. A great strategy for polishing your language is to read out loud. When you read out loud, you can often hear places where you need to clarify or improve the flow of writing. One of the questions I've been asked is how to get started. Here are a couple of tips. Take notes when you do clinical rotations, especially if something interesting happens with a patient. First, write down a detailed description of the experience, and then do some reflective writing about what you learned and what you found interesting. If you take these field notes as you do rotations, you'll have some material to work with when you start your personal statement. If you didn't take notes at the time of the clinical rotation for your specialty, then you could just do some reflective free writing about some memorable interactions you had with patients. This type of generative or discovery writing can help you get started. Another consideration is the writing process. The document is challenging because it's short and dense. You have to fit a lot of information in a short amount of space. However, rather than trying to draft the statement in a really compact, perfectionistic way, let yourself write without worrying about the length. Just try to get all your ideas and examples written out first. Then you can be more selective and edit the text down to the right length. That approach tends to be easier than writing a really dense text from the start. Here are a few more tips. Read a few examples of these statements because looking at models can give you some direction. Also give yourself plenty of time to revise because these statements always take longer to write than you expect. Be prepared to revise multiple times because that's just part of the process. Have a few different people review your draft and give you feedback. That will improve your writing. Feel free to use the Graduate Writing Center appointments for this purpose. The Graduate Writing Center consultants are trained to give feedback on these statements. During in-person workshops, we often give participants some examples of personal statements to review and critique. Here are some guiding questions that you can use when you have the opportunity to review example statements. And finally, here are some links for your reference. This slide has the Graduate Writing Center appointments page and our resource page for medicine. I've also included a resource page from UCSF because we use some of their materials when developing this presentation. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you at the Graduate Writing Center.